Do you ever wonder, with the thousands of years that God invested in the Hebrews, why he suddenly insisted that Christianity was the way? My thoughts on the matter and how it doesn't make sense at all. It's really interesting when you actually sit down and think about it, how Christianity came to be. After all, we use the same Torah that the Jews do, because of course the religion of Abraham transformed into the nomadic wanderers, the Hebrews, which became the modern-day Jew. So why did Christianity branch off of it to begin with? And more importantly, if the Hebrews were God's chosen people, and the Jews today remain as so, with an Israel that's going to be reclaimed by God, why would God change gears and insist that suddenly Christianity is the one and only true way to him? Well, the Christian fundamentalists as well as the regular Christians have the answer, because Jesus came and sacrificed himself for all our sins, but the caveat is, of course, you have to believe in him to actually get to heaven. And this is my contention in today's episode. Why did God suddenly add a religion, call it the one true religion, off the original religion established in that very Old Testament? It really doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about it. And let's go back to Abraham and assume that everything he witnessed by God actually occurred and was actually valid. The whole almost sacrificing Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and his brothers establishing the tribes of Israel. Let's assume all of it was true and the Hebrews were God's chosen people. It makes sense that they would be persecuted through time, as they are giving the finger to polytheism, which they are surrounded by. And of course, by the day Yeshua was born, they will have had a few thousand years in this tradition, which is pretty ironclad in this people. And Christianity wouldn't have existed except for this one man, Yeshua. Whether he claimed to be the actual Son of God or others claimed it for him later, this was the man to which Christianity was based upon. Without him, Judaism would have just continued on, and then hundreds of years later, Islam would have followed. And how long was actually Jesus prevalent in history? About 3 years, that's it. No one even knew who he was until he established this ministry. We know that there was no virgin birth prophecy, according to the most original Hebrew script of Isaiah we have, and there is no indication that Herod actually persecuted and killed every firstborn looking for Jesus, or that he was actually born in Bethlehem, like the biblical story portrays. Basically, the entire foundation of Christianity was all based on those 3 years, until he finally became enough of a nuisance that they hung him on a cross, in which Christianity followed afterward, claiming him not only to be a Messiah, but the Messiah. And suddenly everything changes in Jewish tradition. Suddenly we all have to worship this Messiah as God. And not only do we have to worship him as God, if we don't, or can't because we can't quite believe it, God's going to send us to an eternal torment at hell. And most Jews do not seem to believe in eternal punishment. The concept of hell among the Jews is greatly debated. Some don't believe it exists at all. Some just believe that it's a temporary purifying process. But Christianity is the one that came up with this forever punishment, it seems, for the finite crime of not accepting Jesus as the Savior. Now, it's important to understand that the Jews do believe in the coming of Messiah too. The big contention is they don't think Yeshua was it. And if you really want to give yourself a headache sometime, start researching the Jews' various opinions on how many messiahs there actually are and who has been called a messiah in the past. I read in one source that the Persian king Cyrus was referred to as a messiah in the Hebrew Bible because he allowed the Jews to return to the land of Israel from exile 6th century BC. And some Jews don't believe another messiah is coming because the Jewish state was already established as of 1948. But the basic contention of Judaism versus Christianity is one that we see Yeshua as the one and only Messiah and that he's divine. Most Jews seem to talk about the Messianic age which is coming, in which the Messiah coming will be a redeemer of the Jews as well as a liberator. It is spoken of as near the end of times, when this Messiah will be considered the Prince of Peace and harmony will reign through the land. And Isaiah does mention this. And he's not going to be considered divine. This Messiah is going to be the Redeemer of the Jews and Liberator, but he's not going to be God himself. And in Numbers and Samuel, it does mention the fact that God is not going to ever be human, nor the Son of Man. And of course, a Christian can argue that he's not the Son of Man because he came from a virgin birth. But again, that's not in the most original prophecy that we have to date. The virgin birth story was added later during the Greek translation. Not to mention, Yeshua's life does not fit who they speak of as being the Redeemer of the Jews, nor a liberator. Now, it makes sense that the early apostles, if all of them really existed, may have thought this, as the Jewish community was heavily oppressed by Rome at the time. I'm sure that these very illiterate people were lying in wait for a Messiah who was going to be the liberator. Even in the Netflix series The Chosen, which is supposed to be based off the life of Christ, according to Christian tradition, the apostles are questioning whether Yeshua is going to liberate them from the Romans. They initially saw him as a coming warrior. Now, we don't know actually what the apostles thought of him, since there is no writing during the actual time of his life, but you can see why one very charismatic man would suddenly be embraced as the Messiah for the Jews because of this heavy oppression from Rome. I'm sure they were looking for someone to lead them out. But the fact is, the Jewish Messiah was supposed to bring harmony and peace to the world, and Yeshua simply didn't do that. He may have preached a message of peace, if you believe what he said was what he said in the Bible, but there was no harmony established. As a matter of fact, they put him to death, and they immediately started persecuting the Christians for a few hundred years, all the way up until Constantine made it illegal in the early 4th century. And then a religion formed around this man was probably because the apostles and disciples really did think that he was going to stop the tyranny of Rome. And then it seems the New Testament was molded around the man, not the other way around. Because we already know that the early church fathers changed the prophecies. We know that for a fact by comparing them side by side with the most original Hebrew texts we have. Then of course the Gospels confirm the prophecies when those prophecies were already altered in an error. But this would be my contention and question for God himself. And let's assume that the tenets of Christianity are completely valid. Let's assume that Yeshua was who he said he was crucified, and then 3 days later rose from the dead. My question to God is the same question I had at the beginning of this episode. Why did you suddenly change gears? Because that makes no sense whatsoever. Why did you have a couple thousand years of Jewish tradition, going all the way back to the days of Abraham and Isaac, talk about the prophecies which the coming Messiah would bring peace and harmony to the land, and then suddenly this Messiah is killed, and a whole new religion is established where we now have to worship him, and a new Trinity is established, in which all three branches signify God, and now there's a whole different set of tenets we have to follow under the religion of Christianity, not Judaism, added to the fact that there's now this threat of eternal punishment if we don't. Because here's what God would have done if he was a sensible God. He would have just started with Christianity in the beginning. The old Hebrew texts wouldn't be Hebrew texts but Christian texts, in which they would state very specifically that the coming Messiah was a Son of Man and the Son of God. They would prophesize exactly what miracles he was going to perform, and then they predict a resurrection 3 days following his death. God confuses us with a couple thousand years of Jewish tradition, brings us a Messiah that isn't really the Jewish Messiah, then tells us that no, the Jews were wrong, and it's Christianity you have to follow now. Do Christian fundamentalists and even regular Christians sit down and think about how little sense this actually makes? And this is why the more I study, the more I read, the more I research, the more this whole story just doesn't make sense. It just seems to me that a man came along and decided somewhere in his late 20s or 30 that he was going to have a heavy influence in the Jewish community, whether he believed himself to be divine or not. And because of his heavy influence with largely illiterate followers, another religion was formed after him, no different than Muhammad or Joseph Smith. Because it seems to me if there really was an empty tomb, the Roman officials would have taken note of it, not just some mentioning decades and centuries later about a mischievous superstition. It seems to me that the Jewish community would be no more, that they would have all converted to Christianity, not just one rogue ex-Pharisee named Paul, who didn't even know the man. But my original contention remains that it's just not believable that God would have orchestrated things in this manner. It seems if he was going to build up the Jewish tradition, he would have sent the Messiah that fulfilled the Jewish tradition, not create an offshoot of some different religion that does nothing but just confuse everyone and greatly divide those who follow the legend of Abraham. And because the prophecies were altered and taken out of context during the Greek translation, it's obvious they're not following the Jewish tradition that had been laid down for thousands of years with that very God. And this is one of the common sense reasons that I just don't see Yeshua as divine or a Messiah, but nothing more than an extraordinary man. Now, if you'd like some more content on why I don't think the resurrection actually happened, check out the playlist card at the end of the video. And check out my own tale, which at least I admit is fiction, The Second Fall. What would a Jesus be like if he came back in modern times for the second coming? Link is on the video description as well as a channel page banner, and I will see you next time when we once again take that sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.